Hi, I'm Donna. My boss terminated my contract in front of the entire office. No explanation, no warning. Just silence, and then applause for someone else. They called it restructuring. My family called it finally facing reality. But it wasn't just the job. It was the name they took off the slide, the chair they didn't save at dinner, the mother they erased by pretending her work was never hers. And then, just when I thought I'd been emptied completely, a janitor handed me a key. To what? A forgotten room. A hidden truth. A map my mother left behind before they buried her legacy under someone else's name. Why did they all keep pretending I was never there? And what was waiting for me behind that door? Thursday mornings at Thorntech always had the same rhythm. The buzz of overcaffeinated analysts, the smell of slightly burnt toast from the break room, and the dull ache in my shoulders that warned me the meeting ahead wouldn't be kind. I walked into Conference Room B with my laptop clutched like a shield, knowing what I had poured into this week's financial strategy presentation. 40 hours, at least. I'd finessed every figure, double-checked the forecasts, built an airtight case for the Q2 pivot. But as the projector clicked on, and the first slide filled the screen, my name was nowhere. Presented by Callista Dreven. I blinked, then blinked again. I leaned toward the assistant manager, Kevin, whose mouth was already half open to ask if I was okay. "There must be a mistake," I whispered. "That's my section's missing." Kevin shrugged without looking at me. "Boss wanted it simplified." Simplified. A word that sounded like cleaning up clutter, as if my work had been a mess on someone's desk, and they'd done me a favor by sweeping it away. Callista stood at the front, hair in that neat bun that made her look fresh out of a law school brochure, and began walking the room through the slides I had memorized in my sleep. I watched her lips move, hitting all the points I had prepared. Word for word. She hadn't rewritten anything. She had just replaced the name. Mine. I folded my arms to stop my hands from shaking and forced myself to sit still. I'd learned that stillness could be mistaken for poise. Garrison, our CEO, was seated at the far end of the table. He leaned back in his chair, face unreadable, until Callista concluded the pitch. Then he smiled, barely, and nodded once. "Clear, concise. Good instinct," he said. "Nice job, Callista." The room applauded. I wasn't angry yet. Anger requires space. What I felt in that moment was tighter, smaller, like I was disappearing inside my own clothes. Not rage, just a suffocating kind of vacancy. After the meeting, I returned to my desk. My nameplate looked smug. The plant I'd been nurturing wilted a little more. No one mentioned the presentation. Not Kevin, not anyone. Everyone had things to do. Emails to send, Slack messages to respond to. Then Callista came over. "Rough morning?" she asked, holding out a Starbucks cup like a trophy. "Double shot, no foam," I remembered. I stared at the cup, then at her smile. Too wide, too white. I didn't take it. "I'd love to pick your brain sometime," she added. I met her eyes. "It's not for sale." She laughed like I'd told a joke, but I didn't join her. Once she walked away, I opened my inbox to bury myself in something measurable. But my thoughts kept drifting. Not to today, but to a science fair in the 7th grade. I'd built a model of the solar system out of recycled metal. My teacher said it was brilliant. Callista sang a song from Annie and won a trophy. They told me I was clever, but she was captivating. That was the difference. I made things. She made impressions. At some point, they don't even need to push you aside. You step back by habit. It was past noon when the email came. Subject line, urgent, strategy deck, next week. I clicked it open. Lead contributor, Callista Dreven, again. I didn't even check the attachments. I knew my work was in there. I'd been assembling the draft all month, but her name was the only one that would make it to the top. Again. For a moment, I just stared at the screen. I didn't blink, didn't move, just let the familiar chill sink in. If you erase someone often enough, I whispered to myself, eventually they start to believe they were never there. It wasn't the food, it was the seating chart. By the time I stepped off the elevator into the rooftop ballroom, the room was already pulsing with low conversation and soft jazz. Warm lighting flickered across crystal glasses and gold-trimmed place cards. I scanned the tables, searching for mine. A young man in a black vest approached, holding a tablet. "Name, ma'am?" "Donna Gray," I said, smoothing the sleeve of my navy dress. He glanced at the screen, then hesitated, only a fraction of a second, but I noticed. "Right this way." He led me toward the rear of the room, past the donors, past the VPs, past the sea of polished hair and polished shoes. He stopped at a table tucked next to the kitchen doors, where a faint whiff of onions and dishwasher soap leaked out each time someone entered. I sat alone. The nearest guest was 2 tables away, a junior developer I barely recognized. My name card sat neatly beside a small candle that flickered as if embarrassed for me. Placement isn't just about space, it's about message. I watched Callista glide in minutes later, her gown just flashy enough to draw eyes, but still tasteful. She took the seat directly in front of the stage. Garrison greeted her with a hand on her shoulder, like a proud uncle, which I guess he technically was. At least when it was convenient. Dinner started with the usual speeches, numbers that didn't matter, projects I'd worked on being credited to departments, never individuals. Then Garrison stepped up to the mic. "Tonight, we celebrate the people who shape the future of Thorntech," he began. "And it's always refreshing when that future includes new, bold voices, people like Callista Drevin." Applause, smiles, camera flashes. He continued. "Her work in realigning our client strategy showed clarity, vision, and above all, initiative." I kept chewing, slowly. No camera turned toward me, no mention of my name. I wasn't expecting one anymore, but knowing they remembered to exclude you, that burns more than being forgotten. A man in a navy suit sat next to me, halfway through the entree. He glanced at my name card. "You with catering?" he asked casually. I swallowed. "No, financial analysis." He blinked, then offered a half apology. "Sorry, you're just kinda off the radar back here." He turned his attention to the salad. No more words exchanged. By dessert, I was numb to it. Or maybe just full. But that didn't stop Callista from strolling over with a champagne flute. "Great turnout, right?" she said brightly. I nodded once. She leaned in slightly, voice soft but slicing. "Uncle Garrison always said bringing you on was a kindness. Family helping family. I mean, not everyone can survive in merit-based environments." I smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the kind you wear when you're about to lock a door behind someone and not open it again. "Merit doesn't shout," I said. "It builds, silently." I stood up, excused myself without touching the coffee, and made my way to the elevator. As I stepped out into the night, the sound of laughter followed me only to the threshold. The walk to my car was quiet, but my inbox wasn't. The second I sat down and started the ignition, my phone buzzed. Subject, Q2 keynote pitch. Lead assigned, Callista Drevin. I stared at it for a long time. My hands were cold, my jaw tight. They didn't hire me out of pity. They just never intended to let me grow. The taste of steak lingered, but so did the bitterness. The hallway light flickered as I closed the door behind me. It wasn't the flicker that hurt. It was realizing no one cared to fix it. I hadn't planned on attending the family dinner that weekend. But something about being left out so publicly at the gala, then again by email, again by Callista, made the silence in my apartment feel sharper than usual. I guess I wanted to see if anyone in that house still saw me. The house looked exactly the same as I remembered. Same wind chimes by the porch, same yellow porch light buzzing overhead. As I walked up the steps, I could already hear Callista's voice drifting from the dining room, light and polished, like always. She was already seated when I stepped into the doorway, one hand curled around a glass of wine, the other animated in conversation. No one stood up. My uncle gave me a stiff nod. One aunt looked over her glasses at me and said, "We weren't sure if you'd still show your face after the company dinner." I gave a polite smile, ignored the empty seat that wasn't pulled out for me, and found my way to the one closest to the hallway. Not physically closest to the table, but out of the way. Like always, the roast was being passed around when I joined, and no one offered the plate. I reached for it myself. They talked shop. Or rather, they talked about Callista's shop, her growing portfolio, her new responsibilities, how Garrison was mentoring her personally. No one said my name, not once. "It's great," my cousin Dana offered, "that the company finally has a woman they can trust in leadership." I placed my fork down gently. "I worked there first," I said. 5 years. The silence that followed was jagged. My uncle cleared his throat. "Well, Garrison must have had his reasons." The way he said it, casual, dismissive, made it sound like my demotion, my erasure, was just smart business. Nothing personal, just merit, measured differently. Like I was a decimal point that didn't round up well enough. I wanted to scream. I didn't. Instead, I focused on the mashed potatoes, forcing each bite down like it might glue my jaw together. And then, without meaning to, a memory surfaced. A Christmas dinner years ago. I'd brought a handmade scrapbook of Mom's old art to share, each page carefully assembled. No one flipped through it, not even a glance. But when Callista sang Silent Night, they clapped like she'd won a Grammy. That wasn't the first dinner where silence ate with us. After dessert, I got up to help clear the plates. Just as I reached for one, Callista joined me, a fake warmth in her smile. "You're lucky Uncle Garrison even gave you a chance," she said, voice hushed under the clinking of silverware. "He always said you needed direction." I didn't flinch. I didn't give her the satisfaction. "Direction and erasure aren't the same thing," I said, my tone level. She blinked once, just once, before turning back to the table. I placed the last dish in the sink, rinsed my hands, and moved toward the front hall. I didn't say goodbye, didn't owe them that. But just as I reached for the doorknob, my uncle's voice rang out. "You've got to stop blaming people just because your mother couldn't handle reality either." That stopped me. I didn't turn around, didn't give him the moment. Instead, I let my eyes rest on the framed family photo above the hallway table, taken 2 years ago. Everyone was in it. Everyone but me. Sometimes the deepest betrayal isn't what's done to you, it's what's never acknowledged. The hallway light flickered behind me as I stepped out, but I didn't look back. By Monday, the cold from that night had turned into something sharper. Not sadness, clarity. The kind you get when you stop waiting for someone to open a door for you and realize you should have left the room a long time ago. I walked into Thorntech's glass lobby with a slow, measured pace. Early spring sunlight filtered through the windows, too clean for how I felt inside. The quarterly recognition board had gone up just outside the elevator. I stopped, out of habit. 5 names were listed in sleek corporate font, every one of them linked to a project I'd either built or salvaged. My name wasn't there. 2 coworkers, chatting by the coffee station, glanced over. "Didn't Donna handle the beacon rollout?" one whispered. "I thought so," the other replied, "but maybe she's just assisting now." I didn't interrupt. I didn't need to. Their tone said enough. They want you quiet so they can rewrite the credits. Back at my desk, I clicked open my calendar and scheduled a one-on-one with my supervisor for later that afternoon. The request got declined. I sent another for the following morning. Declined again. When I finally caught him near the break room, he looked like I'd ambushed him. "Just wondering why I wasn't listed for Beacon or Lumicore," I said, keeping my voice calm. He sipped his coffee slowly. "Recognition isn't always about names, it's about culture." I stared at him. "Then why does it feel like I'm being erased from both?" He offered a tight-lipped smile. "Donna, this isn't personal. You're valuable to the team." I thanked him, walked away, and didn't believe a word of it. On my lunch break, I texted Maya. She'd been a friend in college, activist, outspoken, bold. Now she worked in HR at Thorntech, and I hoped some version of that fire still lived in her. We met at a coffee shop 2 blocks down. She waved when I walked in, already halfway through her latte. "You look tired," she said. "Recognition's exhausting." She laughed softly, more out of politeness than agreement. I told her everything: Callista's rise, the stolen credit, Garrison's favoritism, the way I kept being positioned as the shadow in every room. When I finished, she exhaled slowly and looked around before speaking. "Look," she said, "I'm not saying you're wrong, but Garrison doesn't take pushback well, and to be honest, you weren't his first pick." I blinked. "Excuse me?" "He only signed off because Callista insisted," she continued. "Said you had potential. He saw it as a family favor." My stomach turned. "You mean I was the favor, not the hire?" She didn't answer, just stirred her coffee like it was going to tell her something new. I thought of the rallies we'd marched in together, holding signs, chanting, demanding more funding for women-led programs on campus. And now she sat here, smoothing the ripples in her drink, pretending that silence was maturity. Some people grow up, others grow quiet. I didn't finish my tea. Didn't need to. As I walked back toward the office, the wind picked up, colder than before. My phone buzzed. It was an auto-forwarded thread from an internal group inbox I hadn't accessed in weeks. No subject line, just one image. A time-stamped screenshot of Callista submitting a file. My file. My original pitch deck. The one I'd saved under a unique naming format I'd used since grad school. The name on the final submission? Hers. I stopped walking, standing in the middle of the crosswalk. A car honked. I stepped back to the curb and stared at the screen again, breathing shallowly. If silence is power, then I'd been arming them for years. I didn't burn it yet, but I folded every corner of that paper with intent. Tuesday morning arrived like a warning I hadn't asked for. A calendar notification buzzed on my phone just after 9:00 a.m. with a subject line that didn't sit right. Compliance review, conference room C, 9:30 a.m. No reason, no context, just a time and a room. I wasn't on any flagged files. I hadn't submitted anything late. But I'd been at Thorntech long enough to recognize when something wasn't just a meeting. It was a setup. I printed my own reports from the last quarter anyway, highlighted my own signatures, annotated my timestamps. It wasn't paranoia, it was habit, carved from years of watching the unprepared get buried. Conference room C felt colder than usual. The windows were frosted, but not by design. Just age and budget priorities. Garrison was already seated when I arrived, arms folded like he'd been there since dawn. Across the table sat a man I didn't know. Pinstripe tie, folder open, no smile. "Donna Gray," he said without looking up. "Thanks for coming. I'm Mark, compliance audit." I took a seat. Garrison didn't say a word. Mark slid a folder across the table. Inside were 3 documents: expense authorizations, internal memos, and a spreadsheet I'd never touched. But my login was stamped on the bottom of every page. "These were submitted from your terminal," Mark said. "I didn't reach for them. Those aren't my numbers." Garrison leaned forward finally, clasping his hands on the table like he was in prayer. "Sometimes mistakes happen," he said, "but responsibility is still part of leadership. You understand that, right?" I stared at him. The calm in his voice was surgical, measured, detached. I understood exactly what he was saying. You're not here to explain. You're here to absorb the blow. "Can I see the login logs?" I asked. Mark raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" "If these were submitted under my name, I'd like to confirm the access times." He flipped a page. 3 weeks ago, Wednesday, 2:13 p.m. I didn't blink. "That was the day I was off-site for the R&D presentation," I said. "Ask HR. I wasn't even in the building." Garrison tilted his head. "Maybe you forgot to log out. Or perhaps someone else used your station with your permission." That's when it hit me. 3 weeks ago. The R&D presentation. Callista had stopped by my desk minutes before I left. I just need a few minutes at your station, she'd said. Mine's frozen again. Promise I won't touch anything important. I hadn't thought twice. Why would I? She was family. She was mentoring under me. Or that's what Garrison had told people. Now her fingerprints were on my file, but the smudge was mine to clean. Mark tapped his pen once, then twice. Donna, we're prepared to handle this discreetly, but we'll need a formal acknowledgement of the discrepancy. Garrison slid another folder across the table. This one was thinner, just 2 pages. Sign this, he said. We'll process your transition quietly. No further escalation. Clean departure. You'll keep your references. I looked at the folder, then at him. You don't want a departure, I said. You want a disappearance? He didn't deny it, just leaned back and waited. I stood up, collected my own folder. I left their papers untouched. No one followed me out. The hallway was silent. I passed by coworkers who glanced up, then quickly back down. They knew something was happening. They just didn't want to know what. By the time I reached the elevator, my phone buzzed. Callista, one text. Sorry, things got messy. I had to protect my own role. The trap was built from paper, but I just found the lighter. The hallway was cold, but my hand holding the key was warm. Friday morning hit with a strange stillness. No one at Thorntech had spoken to me since the audit meeting, except in passing, through tight-lipped nods or sudden detours into other hallways. I could feel the quiet preparing itself. Something was coming, and everyone already knew. The quarterly all-hands meeting was scheduled for 10:00 a.m. in the main auditorium. Mandatory attendance, mandatory silence. I arrived early, out of habit more than obligation. Rows of seats lined the glass-walled room, morning light bouncing off the polished floor. People filtered in slowly, clumping in pairs and trios, voices low and safe. I sat toward the back, not because I wanted to hide, but because I refused to perform. Garrison entered 10 minutes late, flanked by 2 HR officers. He wore a smile that didn't meet his eyes. The room hushed. The air thickened. We've made great progress this quarter, he began, voice smooth, almost casual. And with growth comes restructuring, realigning our goals with talent. These changes aren't easy, but they're necessary. I didn't blink. I didn't move. And so, he continued, we want to thank Donna Gray for her contributions. Today will be her final day with Thorntech. That was it. No reasoning, no transition plan. Just that one sentence, dropped like a stone in the middle of a pond. A few gasps, some murmured confusion. But no one turned toward me. They looked down, into coffee cups, at their phones, at anything but me. I stood, straightened my blazer, picked up my notepad, walked out without a single backward glance. If this was how they ended people, I wouldn't give them a performance. Back at my desk, a cardboard box was already waiting. A neat stack of my things had been packed, poorly, impersonally. A HR rep hovered nearby, offering nothing but an awkward half-smile. I added one item myself, a ceramic paperweight from my mother's studio. Cracked at the base, but still heavy. Still real. No goodbyes. No last looks. Just the quiet shuffle of others pretending I wasn't there. As I passed the rows of desks, I caught a glimpse of myself in the glass panels. I looked steady, but inside, a part of me was unraveling, thread by thread. At the end of the corridor, near the elevators, I heard it. Miss Donna, I turned. Alban Reyes, the janitor, stood next to his cart. His gray shirt was ironed sharp. His eyes met mine with a calm I hadn't felt all week. He reached into his pocket and handed me a small brass key. It hung from a frayed piece of twine, slightly tarnished, but warm in my palm. It's time, he said quietly. 41-28. South Magnolia. She would have wanted you to see it. I stared at him, unsure. Who? Your mother, Eleanor. I never sold the place. Been waiting for the right reason. Before I could ask more, he nodded once and pushed his cart down the hall. That night, I sat on the floor of my apartment. The lights were off, the TV silent. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator. I held the key in my hand, not as a symbol, not as a mystery, just as something that hadn't been taken from me. They thought they ended me in front of everyone, but someone just opened a door. Sunday morning came with a slow grayness that matched the way my body moved. I hadn't slept much. My dreams were fragmented, half memory, half warning. Still, something in me stirred as I stood in front of the address Albin had whispered 2 days ago, 428 South Magnolia. It was a modest one-story house, worn but intact. A cracked blue door, a sagging mailbox, ivy creeping up the side. It didn't look like much, but I didn't come for curb appeal. I came because it was mine, without ever having been given. I held the brass key in my hand for a long moment before sliding it into the lock. It turned with a soft click. Not stubborn, not stuck. Just waiting. The inside smelled of dust and linseed oil, the kind of scent that clung to old studios, where walls had absorbed every sigh, every burst of frustration, every moment of silent creation. Sunlight streamed through a cracked window, casting a patch of warmth on the floor. I didn't say a word as I stepped inside. My fingers grazed over a worn table, brushes stiff with dried paint, glass jars holding colors long since crusted over. The air held still, but the place pulsed with something old and alive. The studio wasn't big, but every corner told me this was where my mother had poured herself out. In the corner, under a small workbench, I found a drawer with a rusted handle. Inside, a box labeled in my mother's handwriting, "For Donna, when she's ready." I sat on the floor and opened it. There was a letter, yellowed edges, written in careful cursive, hers. I knew the shape of those letters better than my own. If you're reading this, it means life knocked you down hard enough to come back to where it all began. I ran my fingers over the words. I know how this world can twist your heart into silence, how it teaches women like us to shrink our brilliance down to palatable shadows. Don't let them. Don't ever let them. My chest tightened, not from sadness, but recognition. This world was never kind to women like us, but don't let them turn your light into apology. I folded the letter back and held it against my heart. Around me were things I hadn't seen since childhood. Sketchbooks I thought were lost, scraps of fabric from dresses we never finished. I opened one book, and there it was. A sketch I'd done at 11 of a birdcage broken in half, wings soaring above. Taped to the edge of the mirror was a Polaroid. Mom, young and wild-eyed, with paint smudged across her cheek and her hand mid-stroke across a canvas. On the back of the photo, "They don't have to believe in you, only you do." I leaned against the leg of the old drafting table and exhaled. Not a sigh, a decision. I opened the studio windows. The wind carried the scent of old wood and possibility. I pulled the cover off an easel, hers. I adjusted the angle, ran my palm across the worn groove where her fingers once rested. I didn't paint, not yet. I just stood in the light and let myself remember. They took my job, my title, my seat at the table. But not this. This was never theirs to take. As I was cleaning out a lower shelf beneath the work table, my fingers brushed something taped underneath. I peeled it off carefully, a stack of envelopes, aged and labeled, one for each year, and one that stopped my breath. 2020, the day they stole my idea. I didn't open it, not yet, because in that moment, I realized something else. This wasn't just my mother's studio, it was the archive of every time she refused to disappear. I didn't leave with just a key, I left with a roadmap. By Wednesday afternoon, the light in my apartment hit differently. It wasn't softer or warmer, it was sharper, like it had something to say. The envelope marked 2020 sat unopened on the table, just inches from my elbow as I typed. I'd gone back to the studio early that morning, retrieved what I needed, and carried it home like a piece of my mother's spine. Now, I stared at her handwriting one more time before slicing the envelope open. Inside were sketches, notes, margins filled with question marks and circles. At the top of one document, Project Lumen, Predictive Learning System for Client Modeling. My breath caught. That name, Lumen. Garrison used it during last year's Q4 keynote, praised Callista for spearheading innovation. But this wasn't hers. It was Eleanor's. And now that I saw the rough prototype, the old design echoes were undeniable. I clicked through my own saved presentation archives, found the 2022 deck. Slide 12, same visual model. Even the graph axes matched. I zoomed in. There, barely visible, in the lower corner of the slide, a cropped watermark. Elegant script, almost hidden. Eleanor G. They hadn't even bothered to change the font. Something inside me shifted. Not rage, but something colder, clean, sharp. I needed more. I packed my things and drove across town to a rented co-working space I used for contract jobs. Private, quiet. No one from Thorntech knew it existed. I logged into an old email tied to a domain I hadn't used in years. It took 3 tries to remember the password. And there it was, in the spam folder. A message sent 6 days ago from a burner address. No subject, no name. They took your mother's IP and gave it to Callista. Look deeper into the Lumen contract. You were never meant to be more than the shield. There was a PDF attached. I opened it. Screenshots of back-end access logs, Callista's credentials, downloading files tagged EG prototype, and archived Izei, Eleanor G. Timestamps matched the week before her presentation. Another image, a Slack chat snippet. Someone saying, just rebrand this before she sees it. No names, just proof. Enough to make denial a joke. I printed everything, sorted the pages into labeled folders. IP theft, Eleanor access logs, Donna speech draft, Garrison Sach 2022. Each folder felt like a rung on a ladder I didn't know I'd been building. Not out of revenge, but correction. This wasn't sabotage. This was structure. And I'd seen how to dismantle it, one document at a time. I opened my encrypted document folder, started a new file, titled it Exhibit A. They knew. Then I set up a small camera on the table, pressed record, and spoke. My name is Donna Gray. I've worked at Thorntech for nearly a decade. I am the daughter of Eleanor Gray, the original developer of the Project Lumen model. This is what they never expected me to find. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I spoke like a woman who had been erased and finally found the original ink. They built their story using her silence and my erasure. Now I'll use their own blueprint to collapse it. I hadn't planned on building a future that night, but someone just handed me the first brick. The invitation list was short, on purpose. Just enough to fill the room without crowding it, just enough to make the silence louder when people finally saw what they needed to see. The gallery was small, tucked between a florist and a frame shop on East 28th. I rented it under my own name. No company, no brand, just Donna Gray. And that mattered more than I expected. I arrived hours before anyone else, arranging the pieces with precision. Each one had been chosen, not just for what it showed, but for what it said when placed beside the next. This wasn't a gallery, it was a map. The largest wall was dedicated to the Lumen series, my mother's old designs, reimagined with bold colors and sharper lines. Her hand and mine, layered. Past and present, neither asking permission from the other. But the centerpiece, the piece I knew would silence the room, stood alone. A canvas 6 feet tall, framed in black. A shadowed man at a podium, face turned in profile, hand raised with a document clutched tight. Faint, almost hidden in the corner of that paper, the initials EG in soft script. It didn't need a name. Anyone in that industry would recognize the reference, especially him. Guests began trickling in just before 7. A few old co-workers, a handful of local artists, a blogger who wrote about women reclaiming stolen narratives. I kept to the back of the room, letting the pieces speak. Then Garrison walked in. He didn't come alone. Two board members flanked him, laughing politely at something he'd just said. That laugh faltered when they looked up. He paused halfway across the floor. His eyes scanned the Lumen series, narrowed when they reached the centerpiece. He didn't ask questions. He didn't have to. Around him, people whispered, "That graph looks familiar. Isn't that from the keynote?" I watched him take a step closer, then another. His shoulders stiffened, his jaw moved, but no words came. Beneath the painting, a simple black stand held a QR code. Several people had already scanned it. Their phones led them to a web page, private, unlisted, clean. On it, the original time-stamped design files, screenshots of Callista's access history, and a side-by-side comparison of my mother's work and the final Lumen release, all wrapped in a calm, measured voiceover. Mine. "We inherit many things," it began, "but theft should never be one of them." Garrison turned to leave, but before he could, I stepped into his periphery. "This is defamation," he said, quiet but sharp. I didn't blink. "No, this is documentation, and if you find yourself in it, perhaps you recognize the scene." He didn't speak again, just walked out, pale-faced and silent. The board members stayed behind, one of them scanning the QR code as I walked past. An hour later, the gallery was thinning out. I stood by the table near the door, packing up some handouts, when a woman I didn't recognize approached and placed a plain white envelope in front of me. No return address, no name. Just a single note inside. "We see you now. Let's talk. Klein Foundation, Creative Equity Division." I folded the note slowly and placed it in my coat pocket. When you paint with truth, the ones who flinch first are usually the ones holding the brush too long. Staying doesn't mean standing still. It means owning the space they told you was never yours. 3 weeks after the gallery night, I stood backstage at the Portland Convention Center, running my thumb along the hem of my jacket. The fabric was charcoal gray, simple, sharp, and mine. Just like the name on the banner behind the stage. Donna Gray, founder, Studio Lumen. I hadn't asked to speak at the Women in Innovation conference. They asked me. It still felt strange, being invited to speak instead of pushed to listen. The kind of strange that made you stand straighter. Through the curtain, I could see the audience filling in. Rows of professionals, thinkers, artists, journalists. Somewhere among them, 5 rows back, Garrison Thorne had taken a seat. He didn't come as a guest of honor. No stage presence, just a name on the attendee list. He hadn't recognized mine at first, but when the screen lit up with the opening slide, a refined, evolved version of the predictive model stolen years ago, his posture changed. He leaned forward, focused, trying to piece together how something he thought he'd buried was now being shown to an auditorium full of strangers. I stepped onto the stage. The lights were warm, the mic adjusted to my height without a fuss. I wasn't nervous, not anymore. Not after everything they'd tried to strip from me. "Good afternoon," I said. "My name is Donna Gray. I'm here to talk about rebuilding, about what happens when silence stops being a strategy and starts being survival." I didn't name names. I didn't have to. I spoke of systems designed to ignore certain voices, of invisible labor, of the quiet thefts that never made headlines but shaped entire companies. I spoke of the cost of staying small to keep others comfortable. Then I paused. Let the room breathe. "Sometimes justice isn't a courtroom," I said. "It's a room full of people who finally know the full story." The silence that followed wasn't hesitation. It was recognition. Then the applause began, slow at first, then rising. From the stage, I could see Garrison still sitting, his face unreadable. A woman beside him leaned in and whispered something. I couldn't hear it, but I saw his jaw tighten. Then he stood and walked out. I didn't flinch. I didn't follow his gaze. I stayed. After the session, people lined up to shake my hand. They thanked me for naming what they'd lived through. One woman said, It wasn't just a speech, it was a mirror. And then, a man in a blazer and wire-rimmed glasses stepped forward. He introduced himself as an acquisitions editor at a publishing house. "We'd love to talk to you about a book," he said. "Something that captures your experience, the rebuild, the loss, the light you created out of it." I didn't answer right away. My eyes drifted toward the seats, to where Garrison had been. His chair was empty now, but I was still there. He left the room. But this time, I'm the one who stays. The story wasn't over, but the silence had finally ended. 2 weeks had passed since the conference, but the echo of that applause still hummed somewhere inside me. Not because of pride, though I had earned some, but because it marked the first time I'd spoken and been heard without interruption, without someone else taking credit for the sentence before I could finish it. That morning, the studio smelled of citrus cleaner and possibility. We'd repainted last week. A soft dove gray now covered the walls, interrupted only by long wooden shelves filled with jars of pastels, rows of watercolors, and clean stacks of sketch pads waiting to be opened. I arrived early, unlocking the front door before the sun fully stretched across the sidewalk. The hand-painted sign I hung read simply, "The Eleanor Gray Center for Creative Futures Free Access Studio for Girls." It was the kind of name that sounded official, the kind I never thought I'd be able to place next to mine and believe it belonged. Inside, I made my way to the shelf we'd labeled Eleanor's Archive. A small photo of her rested there, tucked between one of her final sketchbooks and the last palette she ever used. It didn't need to be flashy. It just needed to exist. I took a moment at the door, adjusting the wooden welcome sign slightly, before stepping aside as the first visitors arrived. 2 neighborhood mothers walked in slowly, their daughters clinging shyly to their sides. One little girl, no older than 9, made a beeline toward the back wall, where I had hung one of my newest paintings. It was titled "The One They Overlooked." A simple piece, bold brush strokes, a single empty chair surrounded by blurred outlines. She stood in front of it, silent, then turned to me. "Did you paint this?" she asked, tilting her head. "I did," I said, smiling, "and so can you." She smiled back, small but sure, and wandered to the nearest table, where a tray of colored pencils waited. That moment, tiny and quiet, felt more permanent than anything I'd printed on a resume. A few minutes later, Alban walked in, carrying a small box. His posture was still straight, still proud in the way most people don't bother with anymore. I offered him coffee, but he waved it off and handed me the box. Inside was the original key. "I figured you might want to hang it up," he said. I looked at the brass key resting on the felt lining, the same one he'd handed me in the hallway, when everything felt like it was ending. "Your mother wouldn't have asked for this," he said, voice soft, "but she would have hoped." I nodded. "Hope only works if someone opens the door. You gave me the key, I'm just passing it on." He placed a hand gently on my shoulder, then stepped aside as more guests arrived. Later that afternoon, after the kids left with drawings in hand and smudges on their cheeks, I sat by the window alone. Sunlight streamed through the glass, touching the new floorboards. I thought about Garrison for the first time in days. I could have done more, legally, could have dragged him through filings and lawyers and countersuits, but I would have lost years proving what the room already knew. And I didn't owe the world a courtroom story. I owed myself peace. So instead, I built something he could never take away. That evening, just as I was locking up, my phone buzzed. An email. Subject, "Second Chances. Feature request." A journalist I vaguely recognized asked if I would share my story in their next docuseries. The line that stood out most: "We'd like to highlight voices that turned endings into beginnings." I didn't reply. Not yet. I stood outside the studio for a long while, watching the last rays of sun dip behind the rooftop across the street. Inside, the light stayed on, soft, constant. Some stories don't need revenge. They just need to be told without shame. This wasn't a comeback. It was a beginning, written in ink, framed in light, and never needing to be explained again. It had been nearly a month since the studio's opening. Life had taken on a quiet rhythm, one of morning coffees brewed on my own time, of classroom laughter echoing through paint-stained walls, and of moments so small I might have missed them before. That morning, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open, the sunlight making its way across the hardwood floor inch by inch. The email blinked quietly at the top of my inbox. A subject line that didn't demand, but offered, "We'd like to acquire Studio Lumen and its IP portfolio. Offer 8.2 cents. No greeting, just numbers. Terms negotiable," it said. I didn't click reply. I didn't forward it. I didn't hesitate. Instead, I closed the laptop, stood up, and poured myself a glass of water. I didn't survive this to be bought back by the hand that erased me. The following day, I was in a soundproof booth downtown, recording for a podcast titled Quiet Power: Women Who Rebuilt Themselves. The producer had offered me tea and a list of pre-cleared questions, which I'd skimmed and set aside. "What do you want to say to the women listening?" the host asked gently. I leaned toward the mic, voice steady. "That pain didn't destroy me," I said. "It authored the first chapter of the life I actually chose. They didn't cut that part." Later that afternoon, I placed a cream envelope on the counter at the post office. Inside was the final manuscript for my book. The title, The Girl with the Key. I'd spent weeks writing it, early mornings before studio sessions, long nights after classes wrapped. Each chapter stitched with truths that no longer needed polishing. The dedication, simple and clear, read, "For Alban, the first person who believed I was more than what they let me be." That evening, I returned to the studio. The last rays of daylight touched the sign by the door. Kids had finished their session an hour ago, leaving behind bursts of color on drying canvases and half-cleaned brushes in jars. Inside, Alban was rearranging supplies, carefully as always. "I saved you a copy," I said, handing him the book. He turned it over in his hands like it might break, then nodded once. Quiet, like him. "Your mother would have been proud," he said, eyes glassy. "But I think she already knew you'd find your way." He didn't need to say more. We stood for a moment in that quiet, a space filled with everything we didn't have to explain. As the evening settled, I stepped outside. The air was cool, still laced with spring. Children's voices lingered faintly from down the street. The studio lights glowed behind me, warm, steady. In my palm, I held the original brass key, the same one Alban had handed me when I thought everything was over. I looked at it for a long time. Some doors, once opened, never close, and some names, once spoken out loud, never disappear again.